Greetings. Welcome to this discussion on the Ten Commandments as a political theology. In previous sessions, it was stated that the commandments were written on two tablets, and that tradition has it the first tablet deals or addresses our relationship with God and our spiritual life. The second tablet addresses our relationship with each other and how we are to behave towards each other. And so far we have talked about the commandments on the second tablet. You shall not commit adultery, you shall honor your father and your mother, and you should not bear false witness against your neighbor. Today we add, you shall not kill, and you shall not steal. Killing and stealing is an abuse of another, and so I have yoked them together for this discussion. Let's begin with you shall not kill. Now, to understand this commandment, I think it's extremely important that we know how we're going to interpret the word kill. And in the Hebrew language, kill can have many different definitions. And so let's look at three of them. The first that we want to look at is killing is a premeditated act. Killing is a premeditated murder. Somebody is disliked enough because of their personality or because of their beliefs, because of what they stand for. And so someone decides they cannot live, they plan a murder, and then they implement the murder. The scholars say this is certainly a component of the commandment, you shall not kill. Some scholars add to the commandment accidental death. You're working on a project, the project is very dangerous, an accident happens, a person dies, but the scholars argue all taking of life is part of the commandment, so that even if it's an accident, it applies to the commandment. And then I think much more in modern times, scholars add to the meaning of the commandment of not having capital punishment. They want to say that no matter what a person does, or no matter what a person did, you cannot take their life. And they argue the point like this. If the commandment is against, which nobody denies, is against premeditated murder, isn't the state committing premeditated murder when it plans to execute a person who has broken the law and is now going to pay for that break in the law with their life? Therefore, capital punishment should also be included in this commandment as the commandment being against capital punishment. Now, having said all of this, most scholars believe that the commandment only deals with the premeditated act of taking a life. An act that is planned for and then executed. They believe that this is where the commandment is. And if that's where the commandment is, then it can be argued the commandment primarily, if not solely, is directed at the state or at a nation to devise laws to say it is absolutely wrong, sinful, to take another life. And the reason they point to the state or to a nation is because we don't know very many congregations where members are sitting around talking about how they can take each other's life, planning for the destruction of other members. The commandment becomes very simple if we just leave it, you shall not kill. But then Jesus comes along, and Jesus expands the commandment to include hating. Jesus knows that the emotion of hate is very deep and very passionate, and that emotion can, and most of the time does, lead to a broken relationship. By hating, you destroy the relationship. By hating, you are really willing another person to die. And so Jesus says we are not about, as God's people, to break relationships. Therefore, we're not about hating as God's people. Jesus expands the commandment from just a political act to being an emotional act as well. Now, as we have said on other occasions previously, the Reformers also expand the commandment. And they expand the commandment to include no physical harm. The Reformers reasoned like this. Someone can say, I never killed a person. All I did was break their fingers, or break their arm, or break their leg, so that they can't work, so that they will suffer. But I'm free of the commandment, because I didn't actually take the life. Well, the commandment, the Reformers come back to the commandment and say, no. The commandment includes planning and doing physical harm to another person. And this is not allowed. It's against the commandment. And then the Reformers go one step further, and they say, for God's people, it should be a norm and a value that when anyone's life is in danger, is threatened of being taken, is threatened by premeditated murder, or anyone's life who is in danger of being harmed, of being physically abused by another, God's people need to come to befriend that person who is being threatened, or who is being attacked, or who is being harmed. And so the Reformers write in their confessional teachings that the commandment deals with premeditated murder, premeditated act. It deals with hating and very hurtful emotions, and it deals with having to come to the aid of those who are being threatened. Suddenly the commandment encompasses all of life. It encompasses every sphere of our life: physical, emotional, spiritual. Now the question gets to be, how does this commandment affect a congregation? How does it affect God's collective people as they gather together in a community of faith? Well, let's take a look at that. Form. And I'm going to use the example of congregations who get into contentious arguments. For example, I don't know a congregation in the 21st century who has not gotten into a debate and argument, and sometimes very fierce, about sexual orientation, about what the Bible says about gay lifestyle and what a number of people within the church say about gay lifestyle, which may be in contradiction to what the scriptures say. And congregations having this debate often break into two groups. One who want the congregation to be open and all-inclusive, and one who says this is against God's will. And very often those congregations those two groups dig in their heels and they fight over the issue. And the emotional level rises to border on, if not to become hate of the other group. to wish harm to the other group. They deserve to suffer for not knowing the truth. It would seem to me the commandment is not to kill, the commandment not to do bodily harm, the commandment about befriending those who are being attacked applies to this discussion. Or I might use the example of the debate that's going on as I'm recording this lesson about racism in America. And I know our country is divided and our congregations are completely divided over racism. There are those who maintain that racism is the original sin of the United States of America. And at the same time, there are those who contend racism really isn't an issue, and if it is an issue, it's a very small one. And as I lay out those two groups, I can hear and see people clenching their fists and saying the other side is wrong. And when will they wake up and see reality? And the emotions rise. And we began to feel and think in terms of hate. Then we're in the midst of what Jesus says this commandment is all about. Now, if this is so, how does a congregation respond? How does a congregation keep the commandment not to kill? And let me suggest it happens this way. First, as a part of the planning process, not an afterthought, but as a part of the planning process, there is time for active listening. Active listening means listening to understand the position of another person. I have often been asked by people what my position is on a whole bunch of social issues. And I'd learned to say this to the people asking me, where are you? I will be glad to share with you what I believe and what I think. And I will be glad to listen to what you believe and what you think. And I'm going to speak for the sake of understanding, and I'm going to listen for the sake of understanding. But when the conversation becomes an argument and one of us must win, I'm walking away from the conversation. I think this should be the norm in any congregation if it wants to follow the commandment, you shall not kill. I believe also in the planning there is the rule, planning and discussing of this, there is the rule, the norm of behavior, that the conversation will use courteous language. No degrading, no backbiting, no bringing in scandal, no tearing the other person apart. That we are to be courteous and civil to each other. And when we're courteous and civil to each other, it becomes much easier to share and to listen for understanding. And finally, I think it should be agreed upon at the very beginning, as the discussion is being formed by church leaders to bring to the congregation, that if after a great deal of discussion, prayer, one group says, we just cannot do this and we're going to leave, that group is allowed to leave with the respect of the remaining people. That the leaving group still has dignity. I think these are very positive steps for a congregation in keeping the commandment, you shall not kill. Now, let's turn to the next commandment, you shall not steal. Originally, the scholars tell us that this commandment was written as a kidnapping commandment. You shall not steal, you shall not kidnap your neighbor's son. And then later added, your neighbor's children. The son was the heir. The son was going to get it all. So if I wanted my neighbor's land or something else, I would need to get rid of the firstborn son. The commandment then forbade taking of the neighbor's children, either to increase your workforce for your own gain, or to sell children off into trades like sex trafficking. You cannot do this. The commandment also took into consideration at a later date physical property. So it was expanded from kidnapping to taking property, to coming in the middle of the night or sometime when somebody wasn't home and to take their possessions from their house. What belongs to your neighbor is your neighbor's. It's not yours. And then, in the law in the Old Testament, there was the addition of employer-employee relationships. And laws were written that said an employer cannot withhold the wages of an employee, because if you withhold the wages of an employee, you are stealing. The conduct of the day was, at the end of the day, each worker would be paid the wage for a full day, which was the equivalent of being able to feed a family for one day. But evidently some employers were saying, I'll give you the money tomorrow, or I'll give you the money next week. And so the laws were written to say an employer cannot do this. You must give the wages earned by a worker to that worker when the wages were due. You can see the expansion of the commandment. Now the question is, how does this apply to God's people? How does this apply to a congregation? And let me suggest it applies this way. A congregation must insist, and an employee must give good work and competent work. If one is to pay and the other is to, one is to pay and one is to receive the pay. Now this plays out like this. Every congregation that I know of has a pastor or pastors, musician or musicians, secretary or secretaries, custodian or janitor. Some are full-time, some are part-time. Some of those positions are filled with volunteers. But on each side, the work is to be good and the work is to be competent. This is an expectation, and not to have the work good or have competency applied to it can be attached to the commandment, you shall not steal. Now, very close to this is doing the very best you can. Competency and being good needs to be the very best that you can be. In other words, it's good enough is not an approach workers should take. No, good enough is not good enough. The very best, the competence, the very best that you can do is what's required from the commandment. And especially as the reformers looked at that commandment, this is what they are driving at. And then a full day's work for a full day's pay. if you're being paid for a full day and the full day is considered 8 hours, then you have to work 8 hours to get a full day's pay. You don't take off an hour early and say, but I still want the full day's pay. And of course the employer has to give you a full day's pay if you work a full day's work. And these are the types of negotiations and agreements that are made in order to keep the commandment. You shall not steal. Now, before you go off to do your thing for the rest of the day and I go off to do my thing, let me ask you some questions. And it's a way to keep the conversation going. What were the surprises in the presentation for you? Was it a surprise? You shall not steal was originally kidnapping? Was it a surprise that you shall not kill can include emotions? What were the surprises? And what were the insights? Was one of the insights after the number of weeks we've worked on this that the commandments are always being expanded as the historical situation and context changes? And was the insight that what was said at the very beginning, the first lesson, was the commandments are fluid. We've now seen it again and again and again, and that's providing new insights into how the scriptures are read. What did you want to challenge? Or at least to say, I really have to think that a whole lot more if I'm going to buy it. And finally, if there was one thing you would want to say to another person about this presentation, what would that one thing be? I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for participating in this discussion about the Ten Commandments being a political theology for God's collective people. And I look forward to seeing you again next time.